Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the third in a series of webinars brought to you by the Advisors Collective. My name is Joanne, and in the next 60 minutes, I'm delighted to be leading a conversation on a topic that I believe is top of mind for most of us in the age of COVID, navigating organization change. For those of you who are new to the Advisors Collective, we are a network of independent boutique consulting firms, each led by senior experts with proven track records at many of the top global consultancies. Let me introduce a few of them to you. Jeremy Andrulis is the CEO for Third Idea, a human capital consultancy that delivers strategy and organization transformation services. Since moving to Asia 17 years ago, he has managed IT and HR consulting businesses and teams in 8 countries across the region. He has published numerous original research papers in IT and human capital management and spoken frequently at conferences across the Asia-Pacific region. One interesting thing about Jeremy is that he took a gap year in his mid-30s to travel around the world, writing and taking photos. Joanne Flinn solves complex problems of uncertainty, growth, and disruption with leaders, their teams, and businesses. She led PricewaterhouseCoopers' financial services consulting practice through the Asian financial crisis, and she's the author of 3 award-winning, best-selling books on business growth and change. What you may not know about Joanne is that her artworks were exhibited at the Art Science Museum here in Singapore, as she was the artist in residence for TEDx. As for myself, I provide solutions that enable organizations and leaders to reinvent themselves, and I help companies navigate the intersection of technology, strategy, and leadership. I serve as an independent director on a number of boards of several public, private, and not-for-profit organizations, and I'm a professional speaker. What you may not know about me is that I dropped out of kindergarten. As the world continues to stay vigilant from a public health perspective, attention is increasingly shifting to the implications for business, the economy, jobs, and livelihoods. Every single company I work with is grappling with what this means as lockdowns are gradually lifted and people start going back to work. What needs to change moving forward? What ought to stay the same? And how can we help leaders and individuals navigate these changes? There are no easy answers. So today we will be sharing perspectives on, number 1, the structural and systemic changes required. Number 2, what HR can do to help drive these changes. Number 3, the organization culture and leadership imperatives for new times. And number 4, how leaders and individuals can cope with the changes ahead. Now here's what's going to happen. Jeremy and Joanne are going to share a few perspectives on these issues for about 10 minutes each. We will then move into an interactive dialogue, including lots of opportunities for you to ask questions of our experts. With that as context, let me now turn the stage over to Jeremy, who will kick us off.
Okay, thank you, Sian, and it's very nice to be with everyone this afternoon. I think when we look at the lens of transformation, one of the things that has really come to the forefront over the last few months is this concept of Agile. It's not a new term, and many of you came across Agile many years ago, I'm sure, doing software design, product design, or maybe some of you have even attended a course on how to become an Agile leader. But what we've seen over the last few months is this move away from Agile as a point solution, something that's done just for one part of the organization or one group within the organization. And really shifting to Agile as a concept for transformation. It is part of the lifeblood of the organization. And where that really hit home for me was in a conversation I had with an executive, a head of APAC for a global fast-moving consumer goods company. And we were talking about his business, and thankfully for him, he's going well. So he's going well in terms of the B2C business versus the B2B business. And I think what he said was, he's talking about all the various things that he's done to the organization to create more flexibility, go forward. And he mentioned the term Agile. And it wasn't Agile per se as, again, Agile for his leadership team only. He wanted to make this part of his lifestyle and how he really thinks about the organization. It's so embedded, they don't even realize that they're invoking sort of Agile principles as they go forward, because it's just part of their DNA going forward as well. And the way we wanted to construct this today is around thinking about Agile from 2 different lenses. One is going to be the organization lens, another is going to be an employee lens. So organizations, some of the things they're going to look at as they think about transformation and driving in this, taking advantage in some respects of this opportunity that's presented to them, is around the assets they look at, the governance and how they make decisions, and really some of the capabilities. that they put in place to remain agile in these turbulent times. And I think if we take through that and look at the other lens, which is the employee lens, one of the biggest challenges for many organizations, like invoking any strategy, is getting alignment and making sure that the expectations of the organization on how they manage for example, the assets versus what the employees expect in their experience, and making sure that these things are aligned so that when the execution stage happens, it is done much more smoothly in terms of understanding the reasons for it and then the teams being able to execute downstream. So let's take a look at some of these things. So the assets an interesting one because the key goal for assets for many organizations is obviously how do we manage our costs to make sure we have enough cash flow going forward as well. So it's looking at the balance between fixed costs versus variable costs. So if you look at people as one dimension of that, for services organizations, it's going to be a big part, well over 50% of the balance sheet in terms of costs. So the lens is now, how do we think about managing the costs for fixed versus variable costs? There could be fixed costs in terms of some of the costs you have in terms of how you manage on a day-to-day basis. The gig workers, for example, coming much more to the forefront. You think about freelance employees coming forward. As of course, I've had numerous conversations with some of the execs this past month or past 2 months around how do we set up a gig marketplace to attract people? Or maybe more pressing, how do we set up an internal gig marketplace so we are able to actually leverage some of the talent that we have in-house and move people around? Second aspect is around some of the real estate. And you think about real estate, obviously, it's a big part of the balance sheet for folks in terms of the assets. With people expecting more work at home, a little bit more flexibility, what is the percent of occupancy that organizations strive for? Is it going to be 70% or even 60% as we get our next footprint for our next lease agreement? We're not expecting 100% of people to be in the office all the time. So what is that percent that we drive towards? Recognizing that a fair bit of the organization's not going to be either full-time because they're part of the gig or freelance community, or they're working from home or offsite. And finally, it's IT, which is another obviously key expenditure. And the conversations I've had with organizations that have started to invest in IT are really continuing down that road at this stage. They're not looking to either stop or postpone these investments, which says to me they recognize the fact that as a platform going forward, it's important to make sure we're capturing the data, storing the data, being able to access the data, be able to analyze and use it downstream to make better decisions. So those IT investments become a key part of the success going forward. Which brings us to the second around the governance, which is one of my favorite topics, because I think this is where we start to see cultural shifts really happen in terms of how decisions are made. And so I was lucky enough late last year based in Singapore to attend an event by Barack Obama. And it's one of the first events that was done, I think, for this group. And one of the things that really stuck in my mind when he was speaking was how everything that gets to his desk is a hard decision. There are no easy decisions. If it was easy, it would have been done. So I think when he was starting to think about these decisions, it was about, okay, making sure that the team presents him with the right data. So if you see what's that first term that's listed there around data-driven decisions, and many of you have probably seen this term bandied around for a number of years. Actually, I think that's the way I would phrase that is completely different. I would inverse that because I think the way organizations are starting to address this is they're thinking of decision-driven data. As an example, I worked recently with a global energy company, and we broke down their employee value chain into key decisions they need to make. And for them, it was about 7 decisions. There's things like how many people you need on the team, who do you hire, who to promote, who's going to be in your succession plan, who's a high performer, who to retain, and then breaking down, thinking through that lens. And they went through all the data that's required for that. And essentially what it came down to was they needed about half the data they're actually collecting on this, to be able to synthesize. Because what governance is really about in an agile environment is making the quicker decision with as much accuracy as possible. So having to sift out, superfluous data that's just not adding to that value. It really comes from that decision-driven data, which links to the moments that matter as well, because the decision-driven data is all about organizations' views. But the moments that matter are really starting to think about what data and how do we make decisions at those key moments that it's going to drive an experience for employees. And this is where you give managers a bit of agility and flexibility by saying, okay, for example, what do I need to share with employees about their expectations on day one when they come in? Who else is going to have that conversation? What is the team going to say? And how do we make sure we're prepping them and giving them the right set of information and data to make those decisions in sort of this real-time dynamic environment? They may not be perfect, and this is the important part. May not be perfect because 70% of inaccurate data now, sometimes much better than 100% data down the line. The last thing in delegated authorities, and again, it's another area that over the last couple of years, everyone's talked about how do we delegate decisions, be more agile, be more flexible, getting decisions closer to the customer or down the line. And I think what organizations are realizing through this situation is it's a must-have. It's not something that is a nice to have anymore, but it is something that is enabled through formally looking at the accountability structure that's going forward and recognizing where you have to build a bit of trust. Myself and Joanne will talk a fair bit about that cultural shift that's been required to enable that sort of environment where you do trust people to make those decisions. And the third pillar, I guess, or lens that people are looking through when they start thinking about transforming and being a little bit more agile is around making sure that they have the right capabilities. And again, we've heard the terms about continuous learning for a long time now. But again, it hasn't clicked for folks. And I think we've heard also shelf life of skills and IT has gone down for a while. But what's different now, in my view, is sort of zeroing in not just on a long list of these capabilities, but really starting to think about two foundational capabilities for organizations. The first one is around behavioral components that everybody needs around this learning agility. And whether that's the cognitive mental agility to be able to be open to new ideas, whether it's, people agility, where you're able to work through different people and making sure you navigate people and work with them and influence them well. It is a behavioral and a mindset as a foundational element, pick on the new skills. And then also the critical thinking. Think of this as sort of the cognitive sister to the learning agility, where you need to be able to have that ability to triangulate data, where you have to have that ability to synthesize information or hypothesize new ideas that you can pose into questions. And it's when that learning agility and that critical thinking come together that you're able to break through and have those as foundation. I know there's a lot of other sort of skills and competencies out there around resilience and influence, and those are all important. But as the agile enterprise starts to evolve, it is these types of things around learning agility from a behavioral and a cognitive sense through critical thinking that's really going to be a lever that organizations start to drive go forward. Like all things, as I said, that's one side of the picture where you have an organization view around how to drive a transformation through Agile. Again, the alignment from the employee's perspective is really critical. And I think you may have heard some of these things around what do we do around employee experience going now that we have a work at home environment, and what is really changing? And in some sense, it's some of the same topics, but is again, the business case, the urgency, having a point of view about how you're going to create an experience around how are we building trust. And we do know that output measurements through right KPIs are important, but management style doesn't always follow through to that. We could see accountability being delegated down. And this is where I think the alignment can really make sure it's full circle and be aligned between organization and employee view. One retail organization that I work with, they had a beautiful phrase for this, and it was a global company that had a lot of focus on conformance quality. So they wanted their products to be the same as they're moving around the world and not to have too much customization. But they also knew on the same hand that they had to have accountability built into the system and really enable people to make decisions closer to the front lines. So the way they started to drive accountability was they had this term called flexibility in a framework. So for example, they would identify 2 to 3 or 4 solutions that are available to someone wanting one of their retail outlets. And that individual running the retail outlet could choose how they want to go through. So they had the accountability to make decisions very close to the customers, yet it was aligned to the overall framework and sort of conformance quality that they were expecting as a global enterprise as well. And it's those types of things that let them be agile, but kept it in a sort of a frame and a box, which was quite effective. We've also seen, and you probably have examples within your own organizations of accountability and trust going forward. One of the FIs that I work with, they mentioned that as soon as day one hit around the working from home concept, an email went out, from HR to the team says, buy whatever you need. If you're an FI, we know you're looking at a lot of data. If you need a monitor at home, a bigger size monitor, go, just order it. We'll sort it out later. If you need to have new technology for your home environment, make it happen. We'll sort out the expenses. Just use your best judgment. But that statement was not built on the fact they won. They've engendered the trust and built that trust over time that they knew people wouldn't take advantage of that. And that's how you start to see this agile, where you're able to flex and do things very quickly. But that's an expectation you trust us. And that trust links very closely to the flexibility that we've seen. So you've probably seen the same surveys. We've all seen about work at home is everyone loves it. 70, 80, 90% of people want to continue this work at home option. But again, I'd like to see a breakdown of that for people who have kids under 7, maybe, or 8. Maybe it's a little bit lower, working at home all the time. But I think the idea is that it's not just the work at home where they want flexibility. It links to the trust Do you trust me to be flexible in the sequence or how I do my work and how I organize based on what's most important to our internal or external stakeholders? And that's where you start to see the operationalization of some of these trusts and some of the accountability come through. Where are we really flexible in allowing people to do these things when I can't see that person? And the last bit around social is an important, it's another expectation that we're seeing in this environment around how do we create this social environment to keep people connected. But one of the simplest and best definitions of culture I always like to use is it's just the way things are done around here. And it's not exact, but it's a feeling. But the question then becomes, if there's no here, how do we create that culture and those connections in this sort of virtual environment as well? And so you think about how culture becomes operationalized, if you will. There's the branding that happens, the vision, the communications that come, but where it really hits home for employees around sort of what the culture and how we interact is around sort of the decisions that are made and how the behaviors, particularly of leaders and managers. And that's when you know the culture, you can feel it a bit more. And so that's an important part of this conversation to have about how we're creating this social and what does our culture look like. Making sure the leaders are having those right behaviors and how they're making decisions is important. To sum this up, I think we presented these 6 things not as an exhaustive list. There are other levers organizations can start to think about. But what we've started to see is the conversation has started to really tick up in terms of the assets and the governance and capabilities from an organization. How do we make these things real now? Because they're not nice to haves anymore. The executive I was talking to, the lifeblood of the organization. And it's how we're going to go. We won't talk about agile organizations anymore. It's just organization. It's who we are. That's how we operate.
Jeremy, you've really issued a challenge, I think, to everyone, because there's a lot here that needs to happen and seemingly in a fairly condensed period of time. So before I hand the floor over to Joanne, let me do a quick check on how people feel about this. How do you think your leaders are feeling? Oh, they are overwhelmed. Somebody I think that's a very honest statement. Their leaders are probably feeling really overwhelmed. Thanks for sharing that. How about you? How are you feeling? Either as an individual or as someone that actually needs to lead the organization through this process, either because you are leading a particular business unit or perhaps you're in the HR function and you're actually trying to work with your business leaders to drive this change. Oh, Grace says a lot to juggle. I don't doubt that at all. How are others feeling about that? Just in terms of all the changes that are coming in line. Jacob saying from fear to what next post-COVID-19 for clients. Yeah. How do you go from here? I mean, now that we started getting back into the office, people are starting to gradually emerge from the lockdowns. Okay, everybody's feeling a little bit disoriented, right? Because for weeks or in some cases months, people have been in a very different environment, striking a balance between people and process. Comment from Richard. Thanks for that. So I think clearly it's a time of great uncertainty in many ways. Let me hand the time now over to Joanne with that as context.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for sharing the truth of where things are, because the bigger challenge I've seen in turbulent times like this is that unless we're really present to what's happening, we're not going to be taking the right actions to do the next step. So Jeremy, thank you for laying a beautiful landscape of some of the core elements in the Agile one. So what we wanted to do in this next section was to give you a framework of reference, because it may be helpful to be able to say, well, we're here and we get why this may be valuable, or why make the choice to say it's not where you want people in an organization to go. The headline title here is, culture fit or cultural risk. And I'll declare my bias here. I believe that if our culture's not right, it's very hard to create the outcomes that we want. And if you give me permission, I will share a couple of war stories on when it really didn't work. Because one of our challenges of our times is we've got so much on our plate, the overwhelm. I was talking to a regional HRO who covers Mexico all the way through to the Middle East and Africa. So she's got a pretty big footprint. And she was going like, every country, we're working through so many issues so we can do the right things by the people, not from just our company perspective, but also the international regulations in each country. So the overwhelm level and the reality here is huge. And so the cultural one was, the time that's really hit me was when I was in Thailand at a pretty young age. I was responsible for the financial services consulting practice during the Asian financial crisis. And we went from a growing business that was booming like crazy, Tiger's days, to something that had completely dwindled. We lost 90% of our cash flow in about 3 months. And I share that because there's businesses right here, right now, who are dealing with that. And all I can say is that the tough choices we made was, who did we want to stand up as, and how could we collaborate with our other parts of our clients and staff to work our way through it. From a perfect governance point of view, yeah, exactly. Cash flow is oxygen, but leadership is what will bring in the cash flow. Leadership is what will allow the next stage of cash flow to come through. So it's a really tricky dynamic between these two pieces. Sue-Yen and I both do work in corporate governance, and I'm one of the advisory panels at CPA Australia for this. And the truth is, we got through it by busting a whole bunch of rules, but we actually did it with the approval of internal audit. But here's the weird thing. We had some really big conversations about what was going on and how could we work our way through great collaborations that would get the organization and the people through. And it meant we had to do things differently. And some of the policies and processes got updated afterwards. But the pushing our boundaries was huge. So we could keep the cash flow and stay in integrity with who we actually are. It was a rough ride. So if anything in this one helps any of you do it smoother and easier and with more grace, then our time together has been huge and valuable. One of the pieces that we found when we're looking at the Agile space, and in the work that I've done with the University of Oxford over the last 15 years, there's these perspectives of, okay, you know, in stable times, providing we're efficient and effective, we're good. For anybody who lived through the mega process reengineering, you know, it was all about being, you know, efficient, that effective was a good idea. And the lean mentality that many organizations has really focused in on these two spaces. And yet right now we're also dealing with the challenge of overwhelm and fear. And from the point of view of our people being able to make better decisions, to be more efficient in their governance, to lead and be more powerful, owning and acknowledging that overwhelm and fear as part of the parcel is huge. Now, part of our challenge right now is, you know, in stable times, we can deal with a lot of the overwhelm and fear in efficient and effective work. You know, where Agile starts showing up and has showed up a lot is realizing that when we're in an industry, and I'll highlight this, is there some industries, one of my clients is in an industry that does 50-year plans because of the nature of their industry. You know, they sit there, I was in with the CXOs, you know, there was a whole exco. They were having this conversation, they're going like, Joanne, it goes up, it goes down. It goes up, it goes down. They're looking at 30 to 50-year cycles. So a down that's something that's going to be in a 3-year cycle is small beer for them. The thinking that they have is different because of that. And then there's other organizations and businesses who are operating in industries that move very rapidly. And therefore, there's far more need to be able to move fast. As we've started entering this whole stage where people have been talking about VUCA and disruptive times, the power of Agile shows up, particularly technology-based businesses, project-based businesses, businesses that have a strong customer focus. Because you may have noticed our personal lives have moved a lot faster than our corporate lives. And that's actually often dragging the corporate side and the business side into the future. I mean, for decades, I've had better tech at home than I had at work. Kind of crazy. When I was young, I had better tech at work than I had at home. For those of you that are hyper observant, you'll notice one of the shifts between efficient and effective was looking at more than just, is it done fast and cheap? Is it done well? You know, we've added another layer of what we're valuing into what we're doing. As we moved into thinking about the Agile world and the project-based world, it was like, can we do it with rapidity? Can we do it in a way that still creates value as times change? And I'd invite you just to think about expanding this to the next layer of what actually is an adaptive world. Because as we actually start moving up here, there's actually 3 other worlds that we need to be making choices of who we want to be and what we're actually doing. Consider the lead time we've got here. You know, we've gone from a world where we could do 5 to 10-year projects and have lead time. And if you're doing SAP globally, that may still make sense. But the world it's delivering into is not going to be the world that we planned when we started off the mega global rollout. So the adaptive processes, it becomes super powerful because it's also about not just our internal process of looking of what we're doing. It's about how are we adapting to this constantly shifting world. So there's 2 layers of movement happening. And as Jeremy reminded us, this is where the trust and some of the other parameters become super critical. Because otherwise, as some people may be relating to, it's so easy to drop into the overwhelm. And for some of our organizations and people, you know, they're genuinely in fear state, which is a very tough place to create any kind of value from. Just to give you 2 other layers here, because for some organizations, these are the ones that will create the power for you. If we go back 10 years ago, the crisis that we had 10 years ago was off the source of a whole layer of unicorns. companies that have done amazing things progressively over 10 years and really created a major impact. I used to be able to ask people, did anybody go Jack or Grab into the office? And of course, we're all at home, so we haven't, but we might have used Deliveroo recently in the last week. These companies have changed the way that we do so many things. They've seen specific areas they can create value, and they've gone out and progressively built it. Companies like Cisco were the unicorns of 30 years ago. Facebook was the unicorn of 20 years ago. Allied Materials was the unicorn of 50 years ago. Every decade, when there's these crunches, there's organizations and groups that see where there are opportunity. When we move, into the space of going, like for some organizations, moving into the culture that's right for value creation is going to be incredibly important. And then there's the next layer of what is the impact that you're actually about making? Because I've interviewed about 25 unicorns in the last 2 years. And what comes out is nearly all of the ones that get through the crisis have a pretty big vision. They have a pretty clear value system and vision about what they're doing. So as much as for the logical side of things, and I ran financial services, so I could do numbers, but the thing that creates power was the vision. That's what got them through the messy, curly bits up into it. So while we have to be really crystal clear that cash is lifeblood, our vision is what's going to keep us going. And our alignment with that in turbulent times is going to be what helps us create that direction up into these more high, powerful layers of value creation for our organization and our people in the world.
Lots of food for thought. And let's get into more detail on all this. And I want to drive a little bit deeper into the topic of employee experience, which Jeremy talked about. Let's do a quick poll. How important do you think is delivering an agile employee experience in the future? Please respond to the poll and I'll share the results so you can see how you compare. Almost unanimous, not quite. 85% of people are saying that it's critical, and 19% are still assessing, and not a single person is saying that it's not important. So I think it's fair to say that from an employee experience perspective, you certainly feel that this is important. So in recent days, some people have ventured back to the office and found it a little bit of a ghost town, as many colleagues continue to work from home. Jeremy, how do you even begin to recreate the employee experience, and an agile one at that, given this circumstance?
One of the keys is just the connection with people. It's such a fluid environment for everybody. Just the tapping into people on a much more regular basis. And folks, if you do an annual engagement survey, please reconsider that as a great agile approach. It is dynamic now. And I think where organizations are really starting to realize is that, again, decision-driven data, understand those moments that really matter to people is going to be, for example, the first day back in the office, or when they're going to have their first important team meeting as well. So take pulse checks then, grab the data, and then you can analyze the data based on really the moments that matter. So you organize your data strategy and understand the experience based on those moments that are critical to those people, and just do it more frequently is a really important first step.
So moving away from an annual basis and just do regular check-ins with people, quantitative and qualitative, presumably a combination of both. Yeah, let's check in with everyone. What actions are your organizations evaluating to become more agile? What have you done in your organization? I know many of us have been really super busy trying to think about, at the very tactical level, the first thing was how do we protect people's health and safety? But beyond that, now you're thinking, okay, we can't be in this mode forever. We're opening up. So what are you doing to become more agile? Let's take a look at some of what you're saying.
Can I share a war story on this kind of one, just because it fits into this space while people pop things in the Q&A, or B, in the chat? Is one of the executive groups that I've mentored over the years hit one of these decision points, in a turbulent time. And they've been doing a lot of work to build agility in the organization and build that ability for them to be importantly, taking ownership for decisions and to move forward. It wasn't quite as turbulent a time as we had now, but it was up there for their industry. We were doing a really good job from the point of view of the cultural shifts and the behavioral shifts and the decision-making shifts that we wanted. Superb. We even had the CFO behind it and going, hooray, this is working. It was doing well. And then about 5 months into it, we hit one of the downticks in the economy, and the CFO herself issued a policy that said that all country heads had to go and get sign off from the country finance head for any expenditure over 10K. The number 2 in the finance department, the global finance department, phoned me up and pretty much was in this kind of look. I haven't had too many finance people that are in tears, but he was close on it. Because he could feel what had happened was all the senior people had suddenly had a signal that said the organization didn't trust them to make a 10K decision. I bring this out because it was one of my moments of truth in that in these times, the managing of the cash and the finance has also got to go very strongly through the lens of, am I signaling the trust? Am I signaling the belief and the competence of people to make these decisions in great uncertainty? Because
and I think this is a great segue into a question from one of our audience members who's saying, is it possible to go into more detail how organizations move with agility in governance? And I think, Joanne, you just touched on both those aspects for large corporations where it normally takes time, and I think time means forever, to approve products and projects. How do you do that? Any examples that you can share around perhaps this organization or others and how they've done that? And Jeremy, I know you do a lot of work with boards as well. So how do you balance the trust and the agility and the governance? And they're all important.
I think one of the things you start to look at, it's a structural point of view is one. So how have we delegated decisions? So down close to the customer as possible, folks who are really in charge of some of those decisions as well. And again, that starts with trust. We know the stories of companies like Ritz-Carlton, that if you stay there, you get $2,000, as every ladies and gentlemen, which they call their employees, has a spend on employees. They trust them. It's not, and you hear the stories, no one does it because it's about you're enabling the solving of the problem, not the money aspect. So you start with a bit of that and somebody give the trust as well. And that's a structural thing. You can delegate those. The other is on the behavioral side, is that what happens when someone makes a mistake? Really, how does the organization respond if a mistake is made? Is that truly a learning opportunity, or is that individual punished, not publicly, but silently, in terms of opportunities to work on different projects, or there's some whispering around that individual where they're going to stay? So I think you have to look at both. And again, it's the culture. There's structural things you can do around delegated authorities and driving that. There's also a behavioral things. And I think Joanne's story was spot on. As soon as that $10,000 clip level is set, that's a behavior. You're doing things again. You've basically ruined all the trust that you've tried to build up over that time as well. So leaders have exponential power to shape sort of the culture around sort of driving that accountability and trust.
Yeah. Part of a very practical way in this one is, I'll share the story on me because I suspect a bunch of you will relate to. I've had to get my head around all sorts of technology that I've done a lovely job of procrastinating learning about. New tools, all sorts of stuff. And as someone who has prided themselves of being talented and an expert and a high performer, I've had to go back to humble and embarrassed. And it has not been an easy emotional journey. And yet the reality of our times is that pretty much everyone's in that space in some topic or other. And from the practical, I'm mentioning it because it's, an emotive reality, but the practical way of helping deal with this is when you're doing team debriefs or team meetings, is actually put it on the table as a leader. Because once we accept it and permit that that's a truth for us, other people can talk about it. And then the learning becomes a journey. It becomes, okay, I tried this, I didn't get it great. This is what's happening. Who's doing it better? How can we learn? And then it is actually truly in that agile adaptive journey. It's go on.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, it's to the moments that matter. In this case, the moment that matters is that simple day-to-day practice of admitting we don't know everything. The challenge for data-oriented people in times like this is it will take us time to get data. And if our systems take 6 months to get us data, to Jeremy's earlier point, in 6 months, the world will have changed. So as we would say in finance, past performance is no predictor of future performance. So we actually have to have the space that we can go and make decisions that hindsight will prove wrong. And just go, yeah, we're learning.
Make the best decision possible at the particular point in time. And I think, Jeremy, you mentioned something earlier on in your upfront remarks as well, around flexibility within a framework. So that gives you the governance context, but at the same
Sure.
time, the flexibility for people to actually be able to make some decisions as well. But we've got another great question here from Vineet, and he's basically saying companies that have had to cut costs through pay cuts, perhaps deferment of increments, are struggling to create a culture of high performance, even though they have, opportunities to grow their revenue. Do you think this is a temporary phase, or should such companies take some initiatives to actually shift mindsets?
Okay, so let's be frank. Who likes having a pay cut?
Yeah.
That would be a rousing silence, right? None of us do. Who likes being respected for good work and what they're doing and contributing? All of us do. Pay is one component of it. And this is possibly where your mindset type thing becomes pertinent, is for people who've only operated in a world where it's all been up and up and up. They've never dealt with their first major pay cut from economic circumstances. My guess is a good number of people on this particular conversation, we've been around through one or two. We're kind of going like, it sucks to lose 20% or 40%. Not a fan. However, it's real. Now we get through this, and then there'll be, spring will be on the other side. There'll be new things. So part of it is possibly an experience thing, but also just if it's part of our language and the way we think about what we're doing. And it's not talked about, like Singapore was smart when they talked about circuit breaker rather than lockdown. It's same, but different, but it gives us a different orientation to it. So, like right now, the truth is managing cash flow is important. Some of the paychecks people have been anticipating have changed. When Jeremy and Suyan and I were talking through this one of my comments was, I'm Australian, we have this lovely expression, just like wake up and look outside, what's really happening. If there's a storm, you do different things to when there's sunshine. So I think, Vineet, there's very authentically meaningful conversations about mindset, but also about a very distinct focus on where are people contributing and creating value. And that may be because they're the ones who are doing the 50 conversations it takes to talk to every employee so that they feel presenced and seen even if they're away. So that then their minds can move out of that fear and overwhelm into one of the more constructive ways of creating value in your organization. Now, that's value. It helps you build your future, which is pretty important.
There's another lens to look at too. And what I'm really curious to see over the next 6 months or so is the conversations that we're all having around whether it's using more gig or freelance employees. So instead of taking a 30% or 20% cost, we reduce our fixed costs to get our cash flow by over time, just having less people and building the networks, building a marketplace, if you will, that allows you to tap in not just through agencies, which every organization does for supplemental staff, but also the informal networks. And we as an advisors collective are a perfect representation of that. There are a lot of organizations such as us in different domains, whether it's IT focused on 5 gig technology or a bunch of folks doing, market research. There's these informal networks that exist. How do you regularly tap into them for some dynamic work? The conversations are very, very warm right now, even hot, but will they sustain? Or are we going to go back? And I don't know that answer. Can't predict this, but I will tell you that the case is made right now to do this type of investment. So we'll see. And that's another way, instead of the 30% cost, you're reducing your overall fixed costs over time.
Well, and in many ways, this is a challenging topic because for all the reasons it's unprecedented. So we're actually going to have to make the best decisions possible with the information available, as mentioned earlier. Let's do another quick poll. What is the biggest behavior and culture challenge facing your organization over the next 6 to 12 months? I mean, we've put out some topics here. There may be some others. It's not an exhaustive list, but it'd be great to get your sensing from everyone on the call here. Let me share with you the results. 3 ties. Tie between trust, appropriate risk-taking, and decision-making. So, and actually the other 2 aren't too far behind. So clearly there's a lot in everyone's mind. It was probably very difficult for you to choose one of those. Jeremy, what are your thoughts on this?
There's a lot of challenges. That's the most obvious thing. And I think that's where we're in that unprecedented time that you talked about, Suyan. But any situation is around focus as well. So I think recognizing sort of the differentiation, Joanne's chart was really interesting around that. If you're going to create value, making an impact is about making some choices. And that's strategy 101. So what will really differentiate you? Are we going to be an organization that's going to drive risk-taking and drive that? We're going to drive trust. The challenges may be pervasive as well. But as a leadership team, you take ownership and drive the culture that you want to create is very important at this point in time. And recognize that this is our new identity if it's going to shift, or it just reinforces an existing identity you've set in the past. But make choices across those 5. handling all things at once means you're probably not going to do them all well.
It's also dependent on the kind of business you're in, right? We've been talking a lot about trust. Tom here's got a great question. He says, in industries or sectors such as government or pharmaceuticals that are highly regulated, involve major risks or perhaps even life-impacting decisions, is Agile prudent? Could it be that some organizations should retain centralized top-down decision-making and focus on customer or constituent outcomes as opposed to employee experience or speed for the sake of speed? Provocative question for both of you.
Well, here's the dirty little secret around agility, is that agility, the foundation of being agile or adaptive, is stability, actually. And the stability comes in things we talked about. Are your governance, decision-making bodies or delegations, are they clear for folks? Is the language it used, is it stable? Are the processes stable? It allows you to be agile going forward as well. So you're knowing where you're going to be agile and where you're not going to be. And sort of stability is actually the backbone or the foundation around some of the processes, governance, and the culture and language that you use to enable you. So it can be done, but it's where you want to make a choice.
Yeah, one of the key things in Agile, the analogy I found works with quite a few executives, is when you have Agile working, it's like you have a drum beat. The governance of the drum beat, anybody who who's a muso on here, it's like if you were a rock person, the guy who was playing the bass created the drum beat, either the drum beat or the core, just the underlying rhythm. And the underlying structures that Jeremy's referred to are about creating that rhythm. And what happens, so having worked in highly regulated industries, I was working with one a couple of years ago, we deliberately set up an Agile change and transformation structure because the organization knew if they stayed in the outdated thinking, they were dead. So we created the structure and the culture around how we adapted to change, how we took on things, how we experimented. This was, a very large name, sufficiently global and all that kind of good thing. So there was elegant layers of complexity in there. But we had to be super clear on, the governance structures, on the delegations that were there, super clear on our big goals, and then super clear with the staff across the board on what our next goal was and where we're ending. I mean, this is one level transformation 101 type things. But what I can say is because we had the courage to be clear and disciplined with our promises, and that did take time. That was tough when SARS and 9/11 hit, I'll tell you, because, the world fundamentally changed on us. But because we did, people trusted us on the rest. And it hit a point that I had staff, I was head of change, coming up to me and saying, Joanne, we're ready for the next wave. You can go and tell them that. Like authentically, the staff were defining the pace to do. And then you would put in a new thing, but they'd get the support and they'd accelerate. So even in highly regulated environments, you can create the practices of being able to move with agility and adaptability, and some of these higher ones, in keeping with the life impacting decisions, the governance and regulations that you need to honor and respect for your license to operate and for your promises to your clients and customers. I share that because in my experience, it's entirely possible. And when you get there, oh my God, your people are in such a different place. And because they're in a different place, the organizational results are in an entirely different scale.
And it sounds like a paradox, but the analogy that you used around drum beat is a fantastic one. Any musicians, you would need to have something steady and then you have something moving. You wouldn't just say, let's just only have drum beats, right? So I think it's about managing both dimensions. By the way, I also want to let you know that for those of you who have not yet done so, you're very welcome to download our free ebook from the Advisors Collective. It's 15 pages of insights from our experts on everything from workforce planning, data analytics, employee engagement, recruitment, and so on. So here are my key takeaways from today. Number one, in order to weather the storm ahead, structural and systemic organization changes will be needed. Jeremy walked through a framework for that. You may not choose to pull all of those levers at the same time. In fact, you probably don't want to choose pull all those levers at the same time, but you could probably make some structural and systemic changes in order to enable agility. Second, HR plays an important role in driving these changes, and whether it's strategic or tactical or anything in between, that's going to play out significantly because it's everything from policies, and we sometimes get stuck in legacy policies. So take a critical eye to which policies need to change in order to enable us to operate in this new normal. Number three, leaders too will need to adapt to this new environment in order to create the type of agile organization that is prepared for future headwinds. And for sure, there will be additional headwinds that come our way. It is perhaps in the way they manage, perhaps how they think about empowerment, how they think about delegation, how they think about doing that within a framework, in fact. And finally, at an individual level, we do need to equip people with agile mindsets and also ensure that they are prepared, as Joanne mentioned in her last anecdote, for them to proactively come and say, hey, we're ready for the next change. That takes individual mindset shift that's really critical, and we need to help people get there. I'm going to flash a slide up with Jeremy's, Joanne's, and my contact details in case any of you would like to reach us. You know where to find us. We have really been talking about some very challenging issues with no easy answers, but hopefully we've given you things to mull over as you think about how to drive this forward in your organization. Change starts with each of us, and from there it ripples out into the broader organization. So thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks very much.